for this one, we're going to be going over what should be the currency for the nations in nations in all cases. Not as we're not going with an idea of a single currency. We're just going to talk about more in general. Now, before this, I'm going to be putting up my Patreon in the chat. It's also in the bottom of the description, and we're going to be talking about just a few different options, more in the general sense, because it's kind of pointless to really go over very specific senses. This is more of the in a general sense of what to do with it. This is basically looking at really in the case of what's happened with Venezuela, how their electrical grid has gone down, and it's basically made it very hard to interact with abilities to gather cash and those situations like that. So even with the electrical grid, it makes it very hard in most cases to do non-physical cash, especially with an electrical grid down. Now any country can have this problem because there's a high likelihood that there was either physical sabotage or potentially sabotage through the either CIA or National Security Administration of the United States, because the United States was talking about this since going back to even during when they were talking about the whole Russia thing, Russia possibly hacking our electrical grid. That we knew that was not possible, but they would never have mentioned that unless it was possible that we could hack another country's electrical grid. Now, people that were talking about this, they were the biggest proponents of talking about this, were people like Mike Pompeo. Now, people like Mike Pompeo were talking, oh, that's not possible. Well, when we start to look at this is where we get to the idea that this is a very important thing to look at. And we need to understand that this is very crucial. And we need to start looking at, not just from our country with it, but also other countries around the world, need to start looking at what to do in these cases, because this could be a catastrophic case of what to do. Now, we have there's options in how countries handle their currency situations. You have for the most part, India has gone to a cashless society. If you look at the cases of the United States, we've gone to a fiat currency, which is basically it's paper that's no better than the actual people that believe in it. If you look at historically people in history, they've gone to precious metals that people have, or even semi-precious metals in history that they can actually trade with one another to keep a sound monetary policy and easily have voluntary trade. And then you had the last one, which is more recent, which is cryptocurrency, which is really just a digital currency that's meant to kind of replace a lot of other currencies and become a medium for trade that's controlled by a third party. Now, some of them are meant to counteract inflation, some are not, and but when we're talking about being susceptible to power outages, we're talking that the ones that are going to be very difficult are essentially cryptocurrencies are going to still be susceptible to the power outages, as well as your fiat currency as well, for the most part, because most of the fiat currencies are going to be held into a lot of electronic banking machines, ATMs, and a lot of the vaults are going to be electronic to access them, and as well as those different things. But and then we have the case of a cashless society, which is going to be based solely on the idea of these bank cards and credit cards, which is essentially going to the idea of what it does is it basically makes it so there's no cash exchanging hands of any type, and that completely makes it so you're reliant on this electrical grid. Now, uh, we've had many of people that have warned on the idea of a cashless society being essentially a problematic thing for being against people's liberty, because the fact is that means they can essentially adjust this actual value, because you're basically handing over the actual purchase power 100% over to the actual government. This is even worse than if we actually have an actual printed actual supply, as opposed to going to completely cashless. Now what they can do, they can essentially manipulate. Now you're handing these manipulated values completely over to a central bank. That's you're going to a completely different system, which is not even following any type of idea of supply and demand to any degree. You're trying to they're trying to calculate these things from a virtual level, and it doesn't of things that don't even exist, and they're essentially making these things up as they go, and you're handing every bit of power you had with it. Now, there's been many people in history that have warned against the cashless society because of those problems, and this is even people who have warned that even before we even had that they felt that it was the issues even that have been born well before we had a central bank, and these are people that have would have actually seen the actual problems, because my mom's grandfather, who ended up living through the depression and working through it, and is one of the people who stated to her that the worst possible thing that we could have actually happened, that we could actually have happen, would be a cashless society, and that there's going to be people in power that are going to try to push for it. And if you look at when we look at for like the we'll see like the human like basically I mean, if you look at some of these things with when we start to see like the freest nations out there, you're going to see that the countries like India that are basically that are actually more closer to less freedom, and that's something that that should be noted. And it's should be noted right there is that they're actually lower on the freedom itself, and India ranks 110th overall in overall freedom, and that should basically make people a little bit scared when it comes down to the actual levels. And that's getting near the bottom of the list. And if you compare that with other countries, with it, you're going to see that that's the Philippines is actually up to 73rd in comparison, and they're a country that has relatively this same size of the same similar type of government with how they actually export stuff out, and you can see that they're much higher up there, and and the types of work that they're doing out of their nation, you can see it's very very similar as well, and it shows that there's a definite difference. And this is where we kind of see that there's a huge problem there. And number one is New Zealand, despite what they end up doing with the media, with trying to blast the people who recorded the event of that terror attack. But what it comes down to it is you'll see the ones out there: New Zealand, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, Ireland, United Kingdom, Finland. These are the ones in the top 10. Norway, Taiwan, and you see you have to go down a few to get to the United States, and you see that basically is that the problem is that when you start to go to the idea of a cashless society, it's going to kill your actual freedom. Now, when we start to look at the one that a lot of people tend to want to look that everybody was talking about a few years ago, there was this whole big thing of everybody should copy with it, and everybody should look toward it, was Venezuela. Well, they rank 161st out of 162nd. Syria's the only thing lower, and the reason why is because that's essentially a war zone. Yemen's 160th, that's a war zone. Iraq is 159th, that's a war zone. Libya is 158th, that's a war zone. Sudan 157th is what it calls the closest thing that's not technically a war zone. So basically all the things around Venezuela are a war zone. And Venezuela was essentially talked up as this whole big thing that Bernie Sanders, that who else? Sean Penn was talking it up as the greatest thing out there. You also had people like Michael Moore talking it up. It's a great thing out there. The Young Turks were talking it up. All the people with Young Turks and Secular Talk, all the people in the Young Turks Network were talking it up like it's the greatest thing out there. But the fact is, we know that it turned out to be it's a complete and utter failure. Now they want to change, and they want to talk about all the Nordic countries. But the Nordic countries, as we see, are actually market economies, and they're actually, when we start to actually look at them, you'll see that their personal freedom is much higher than they actually show in comparison to the United States. And the fact is they would actually have to come up quite a bit. Even their economic freedom is higher. When we start to look at, then they want to talk about Denmark. Denmark is a 7.77 on the economic freedom. You compare that with the United States, it's 8.03, so it's not much higher. But in personal freedom, Denmark has a 9.33 next to the United States an 8.75. And this is based on Cato's Human Freedom Index. So we're talking is that, and they also want to talk about the other one, I believe, is Sweden. Let's see where Sweden hits. No, Sweden should be up there as well. Yeah, Sweden's right here, right where the United States is. 7.44 for economic and 9.33 for personal freedom. So if they're talking about this, they're going to have to really start changing around their system. is basically all they have is essentially is they're more of a welfare state. They're not an act. They're actually a market economy. Uh, they're actually still a market economy, and when it comes down to it, as they do a lot of taxation, but there's a lot of things that they have greater than us. They have in most cases they actually have like when it comes to freedoms for guns, they'll actually have lower amounts of regulations on guns. They'll have lower amounts of regulations for property. They have more property rights out there. So when you start to look at that, you'll see that when you look at these countries, you'll see it's a lot different. And when you compare that to that you're gonna see that it's a lot different in comparison, and it ends up being different for it. When you go down to like, we'll see countries like, and that's why you don't want to go on the idea of where like India is. Where India is basically has a relative, they have kind of an even relatively low score on both, and that's because they're actually known for being quite harsh on both personal and economic freedom. And that's because a good portion of the country is actually socialist. And so if we want to actually have this idea of if a system goes down so we can still have voluntary trade, we're going to have to not go with the cashless society, because that's really meant to keep track on people, and that's so the government can still track it down. So when we start to look at that we know that that's essentially bad. Now fiat currencies, we can tell, are definitely bad. We can because they've essentially, that's been how countries have actually fallen. When you start to look at countries like Switzerland, Switzerland is really ranks as number 2, and we know that they're when it comes to their economic freedom, they rank it an they're an 8.39 rating, which is just a hair off of the top, a 9.19 ranking for personal freedom. So they're right there at the top, and what they do with it is they're one of the top countries for actually producing gold. If you look at another one with it, is number 4, Australia. That's another one that actually produces a great deal of gold in the market. Personal freedom, 9.18. Economic freedom is the 7.98. You might not have as much economic freedom there with it, but when it comes down to it, they do produce a lot of gold in that region. If you go out to specifically Perth, and you will notice that there. So when we're talking about it, these are the countries that are doing that. Now when it comes down to cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, they're only as good as the nation stays up on electricity. Once the electricity goes down, you have that stuff locked out. That's basically, it's no different than it's going to be reacting no different than an ATM. It's just, instead of an ATM, you're doing it with your personal computer. And once the electricity goes down, it's personal computer or cell phone or whatever. And once that electricity goes down, you're at the beck and call of whatever you have for your alternative source of electricity, batteries or whatever. And once that stuff goes all the way out, you have nothing more. And it doesn't matter if you have cash locked away, you have no access to cash if all of your money is there. Now, then we look at our last source, which is going to be your fiat currency. Now, fiat currencies are essentially, yes, they're going to be actually out and readily available, but the problem being is because we have these are essentially going to be based on essentially fake money. It's monopoly money, frankly. It's only as good as people believe in it. If they start distributing monopoly money, it would have essentially the same effect. If people believed that monopoly money was actually worth something, then it would actually have the same impact on the actual marketplace. And basically you have to understand with it backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. Basically, it means that all it means is we're going to basically pay our bills. We're paying our bills with fake money, with paper. We're not actually we have not backed anything by gold since we left the Bretton Woods Agreement. Bretton Woods Agreement was a certain amount of gold was going to back our actual was going to be, you can purchase a certain amount of this fiat currency was going to essentially, or actually the currency was going to buy an ounce of gold. And this was actually the idea. I believe it was it $36 per ounce offhand, and each of these would buy 1 ounce of gold. Well, when other countries said, well, you're basically holding on to your debt is more money than your debt holdings are more money than actually you have in gold to back it, because you're not accounting properly. And what that's doing is that's meaning it's not worthwhile to hold your debt, so we want to essentially replace it with gold. So when that was happening, when other countries were doing this, our country decided, hey, we're going to get out of the Bretton Woods Agreement to stop this from happening. And that what ended up occurring was we ended up getting out of it, and that's where we are today, and we have essentially what we call a fiat currency. Fiat currency, which basically means that our currency is only valuable if people believe in it. And you only can keep that up as long as people do that. Well, since other countries are starting to adopt back to a either gold-backed currency, or where currency is actually gold itself. Now, the whole big problem with this is that there's a lot of countries, such as China, is buying up gold to back their currency, number one. And number two, we also have other countries that have actually tried to establish gold as their currency to itself, and that was a lot of what our whole big rift with Libya happened to be. It had nothing to do with anything else. It had to do with them using gold, because the fact is it was going to create a national currency in potentially Africa, at least North Africa, if not all of Africa. And this was going to essentially reduce the acceptance of a fiat currency. And if they're not accepting fiat currency within the region, it was going to be very, very damning to the whole region for the United States. And that's basically what we were dealing with. Now, when it comes down to what's the best for nations overall to deal with crises, we could basically say that fiat currencies, we got to basically throw those out, because historically those are only as good as people believe in them. Once they stop doing that, it's going to wear out, and other countries are going to say, you know what, we're not going to trade with you, and that's going to be the end of it. When we're talking about cryptocurrencies, the problem with those is, even if you do a one to guard against inflation, it's only as good as the electrical grid stays up, and as they can guard against things such as the people trying to illegally mine more of the cryptocurrency itself, and essentially causing problems within the actual system. So that's always going to be an issue, and you're going to have that's going to essentially create what we would have is the fake in the case of bitcoins, like fake bitcoins on there that are essentially going to be treated as real Bitcoin. And people are not just using it from doing it from traditional computers. I mean, they've been able to hack things like Tesla cars, their systems to basically do this for them, and it makes it almost impossible to stop. So we know that that's not exactly a legitimate way to look at the way to balance things out. We know that cashless is definitely not an option because you can't, when the electrical grid's down, you can't hand them a piece of plastic. A piece of plastic is useless. And they're not going to say, okay, we'll take this piece of plastic. Well, the fact is that there's electric system is down, it doesn't matter. In many cases, if the internet's down in many of these restaurants, they can't take cards, and that a lot of times shuts down restaurants from actually making money. So unless you have cash on you, so that means that at least that fiat cash we're talking about. Now that leaves us back with the last thing is we're talking about rounds of the traditional original currencies that were used historically. And that's really what is the only option for nations to go towards. And I know it's going to be hard for people to accept, but that's what we need to accept. And there's a reason why it's been used for thousands of years. And there's basically historic reasons for this because it has more use than just actually as a currency. These things actually have an actual legitimate use, has being for jewelry or electronics uses or for decorative uses. So it actually has its actual uses beyond that. And when we're talking about these ones that are used for currency, such as when we're talking about copper, we're talking about copper, palladium, platinum, silver, and gold. These five we know that have actually been used in history up to now for holding wealth. We know that those five cannot be recreated. They're actually elements, and you cannot recreate an element. Elements are in themselves their own thing. And when we look at what this would do, this would essentially create so that you cannot copy or forge these things because it would cost you just as much, if not more, than what the original would cost. And to duplicate it would be nearly impossible. That would essentially eliminate the usage for trying to get people to stop copying currency. Now, when we're looking at like paper currency can easily be copied, and it's not that hard. And all you need to do is essentially get something that looks very, very similar, and most people will take it. And when you're talking about a cashless society, all you have to do is essentially hack the system, and you can change your actual bank account number. When you look at cryptocurrencies, all you have to do is hack the system and start mine and be able to hack the system to mine more, and then you get free money. And a lot of times you can mine more to get hundreds of thousands of dollars more. And when we're talking about this, it doesn't take much more, because if you look at the amount of like the Bitcoin price, I mean, we're talking currently it's running at about just shy of $4,000 in US dollars. And that means that would be very expensive. Now, this is where we should be looking at how these things should be working, is if we're near $4,000 a piece, just for each one, then which we know it was actually much higher at one point. It's actually a fraction of what it used to be. It used to be about 3 to 4 times that price at its peak. We know that that most likely the people that are trying to keep down the price of gold, I think it's I forgot the name of the department. It's in an executive, but it's basically tries to equalize things out to make sure that it doesn't impact the markets so that people don't, so the markets don't fail. I forgot what it's called, but it's basically most likely that's what happened. That occurred. They viewed Bitcoin as an actual problematic currency that was competing, just like they view gold and silver as well as palladium and platinum and copper as well. They view those as other problematic investments with the actual market itself, so that it would compete with the US dollar, and it would cause the US dollar to bottom out. And they don't want that because it would then spell the end of the fiat currency and the end of the whole way that the economy under this basic monetization of debt works. Now, when we look at this, is what the only way to actually do this would essentially be to set up on this, and what it would cause is it would mean that the government would have to, at least the U.S. government would have to go down to what it states directly in the Constitution, which means it cannot print money. It would have to coin money. Now, we know that you can't make paper coins. Paper coins don't exist. You would have to make, when they refer to coining money, they refer to coining metal coins. And those metal coins would be listed specifically as those elements that I've mentioned before: copper, palladium, platinum, gold, and silver. And those would be the 5. And those were meant specifically because those are the ones that actually hold the most value and are the most common to use. And we keep them as the pure elements, so you basically, so they could not be copied themselves with an actual alloy. And what this would do, this would make sure that when we distribute the coins out, which a coin is nothing more than a government-sanctioned round, it would make it so that this would be how people would spend money. Now, could this still be done in a cashless system, so that people were not in a semi-cashless system, so people were not holding coins all the time? Yes, easily. But people could actually hold coins of higher value and then get coins back, and as well, if they wanted to hold coins as well. And we could basically make coins of different size so that they could basically have different values. It would just change the way we would hold, the way wallets would be made as well to adjust for such things. Obviously, you would have change wallets, which would be much larger. And this would be how you would hold your money. You wouldn't be holding money in the ideas of actually bills. You wouldn't have any, wallets would not be developed for bills anymore. They would be made for actual coins, and coins only. The idea of having bills anymore would be completely useless. And the reason why is because the idea of a bill would be making it so you could have a counterfeit very easily, and this is why the founders never wanted bills. Even though we've had certain people as presidents try to go to bills, because they could essentially print them up like nobody's, like they're going out of style, but the idea of it was never actually sanctioned. And when we have the idea of these coins, we can actually have voluntary trade when the electrical grid goes down, because you could trade these coins out for actually goods without the government being in the middle of it and having to worry about anything. It could just naturally happen. If you need tomatoes, if you need sugar, if you need bread, if you need to, let's say, pay a bill or whatever, if you need to pay a bill, you can go to the bank and say, hey, I have these coins, I need them deposited, and I need basically a paper form that I need to mail out, and that can be written out, and they can actually physically deposit those for you, and It would be an exchange, and it could work very, very simply. And if you do this, they could essentially do this and create a system for you to allow you to do this in a system when the electrical grid is out. When if we were going with a fiat currency would essentially eventually come up to a point where people are going to say, we don't believe in this anymore. This is just paper. And people are going to come up to that point to where they're going to say, we don't believe in this. This is just useless paper. And we're having countries starting to come to that point because they're seeing that we're adding on debts and we're not actually paying it back. I mean, if you go to the debt clock, you can actually see that if you go to us.clock.org, you're seeing the actual debt that keeps rising up, and you'll see it just keep climbing, and it climbs so fast that you can't even keep track of it. We're over $22 trillion, and it climbs so fast, basically, you blink, you'll miss $100,000 going away. It's basically $100,000 will go away in a second. And you have to understand that can happen in like a second. And that's what's happening with it. Doesn't matter how much we're bringing in. And we're also from the pension liabilities. We have a bunch of those with us. We have state debt. That's a problem. We have local debt. That's another problem. And you can see all these issues that are coming in with it. And one of the things is we're paying a lot of we're basically what we're doing is what's happening is we're basically we just keep adding on with it. And what's the reason why this is happening is we're not paying off any loans. We're actually adding on more loans to this, and what happens is we buy off the old loans when they come due, and we have them issue more loans. And it just basically is something that's it just doesn't make any sense when it comes down to these things. And we need to understand that if we're going to do things financially, even on the global scale, what countries need to do beyond the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is just embarrassing. We should understand that. If we go out to, let's say, we can go into, on this day in 2023, we're actually set to be at about $26 trillion. This is basically assuming that we do not change presidents. We go back to 1980, you'll actually see that we weren't even, on this day, we weren't even at $1 trillion. You go back to 1990, we weren't even at $3 trillion. You go back to a whopping year of 2000, we weren't even at $6 trillion yet. 2004, we had not hit 8 trillion yet. 2008, we didn't hit 10 trillion yet. Then when we start to get to 12, we're at 15 trillion. 16, we're at 19 trillion and change. And then we get up to 19, which is our current year. This is our current debt clock as we see right now. Then we get basically we look to the future. We're probably looking closer to 26 trillion. The debt per citizen is probably going to be is expected to be over $76,000 per citizen. Per taxpayer, it's supposed to be about $196,417. Now, this is where we need to actually start looking at what we need to do for currency, because this is going to be when countries are going to start saying this, and they're going to start saying, you know what, we're not going to pay any more money for this kind of stuff. And this assumes that we're not that we're going to continue on the rates that we're currently at. And this is based on certain things out there. And then if you look at based on certain things, the CBO says about 26.3. The GOP House Committee on the Budget says about 23,975. USDC, that's the debt clock, is about 26,046, and the Office of Budget Management says about 27,056. I would tend to go with the OMB and tend to take their amounts with it. Go with the highest amount on there, because the fact is it's usually going to be the highest amounts on there because they just don't know when to stop spending. Now, what this means for when we get to currencies is that even beyond just basic electronic grid crises, we also have other things that can actually occur in between, especially with people like Pompeo, like Bolton, like Haspel at the wing of the actual foreign policy. They're going to try to jack up the actual bills and start to add extra costs onto the budget. This means that what's going to happen is countries like Russia, countries like China, that are actually holding a massive amount of our debt are going to say, you know what, we're not doing this anymore, and they're going to start cutting us off because it's not financially viable anymore. Especially because what we're going to do, what we're looking at doing, this is from the Pentagon, is we're still putting money into NATO, and the Pentagon now wants to essentially put a lot of money into nuclear weapons on the naval fleets to essentially harass China. Now, if you think about this, we're essentially harassing our top two debt holders. Now, that would mean that they're not likely to renew our debt, and they're going to basically tell us where to get off at. They're going to say, you know, we're not renewing your debt, pay up right now, or we're taking property. Now, this is going to be a major problem because they're going to have to basically find a way to deal with those debt holders in a way that doesn't have a massive impact immediately, because when you start looking at the debt to GDP, we're already over 100%. And that's a massive issue. And this is why when we get to these currency crises, we need to understand that it's more than just an electrical grid that's the problem. And that's why we need to go down to an actual real sound monetary policy. And that's why historically people have relied upon precious metal coins, going from all the different things that are single elements and using those for the actual coins. And the reason why is because it makes your actual government actually stick to an actual sound thing and have to actually pay off loans, because they would have to pay off with an actual thing. They can't pay off with paper, then you can't print your way out of debt. And that makes, and you would have to basically, the only way you can actually get your way out is to raise taxation and work with taxation for your actual sources. Well, they know that they can't do that without, there's only so much you can pull from taxation. If you look at the historical tax charts, because people are naturally only willing to stay so long to pay taxation, eventually they'll bolt. And that's why it doesn't matter what the taxation levels are, there is a maximum that is going to be paid in revenue. And that what they're getting right now is the maximum revenue that they will ever get. That's why when they're setting revenue records, they needed to understand that's a sign to tell you you need to cut spending massively, and that's the actual issue. That means you need to start uh, taking all of your stuff in your budget and start reducing it down. Now, what this means for currency with it is this can cause a currency crisis, and that's where we're looking at right now. Is this is where a currency crisis comes in. Now, cryptocurrencies are not going to solve that because essentially, on the whole, a digital currency, regardless, it still could be hacked into, and it still could have its own problems. And when whoever becomes the third party that controls it can change the amount that gets distributed out, even if it's meant to counteract it, and it's going to cause the same problems. Um, a cashless society is going to have the same problems as a fiat currency, just accelerated. Then you have then you have the things where we have the same problems right now with our fiat currency. So the only option we have is to go to a sound monetary policy based on these precious metal coins. And it doesn't matter what we think about that, it's the only legitimate option, you have globally. Because the fact is it's the only safe option for any person. This is why you'll find many companies that are doing it, because they realize that this is a safe option for the holder of wealth. And even regardless of what they're trying to state for saying, oh, the economy's doing good. Well, the economy really isn't, because we're pulling in too much debt, and it's overwhelming whatever type of benefits we can grab. And it's basically holding that back. And when we look at it, our defense only needs to be about 1/3 what it really is currently. Now they're actually asking for more money for defense as well. It's not defense, it's actually military, but they're trying to call it defense. Now our defense only needs to be about 1/3 of what it is, about $250 billion a year. When we look at the actual thing, we could actually get down to a budget that's much smaller. We could raise the actual standard for people to get onto Social Security a little bit each time. That would apply to Medicaid and Medicare as well. Medicaid we can essentially eliminate and make and put that over to local charities. This would essentially get rid of a massive amount of debt. We could do the same thing with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program as well. People refer to that as food stamps. Eliminate that as well, and hand that over to local charities. There's plenty of local charities in every state and every local community that take these things on, that do a much better job, that give much better quality for food than any government program could ever dream of doing. And they're not going to be allowing people to buy lobster and buying cheese puffs for their on the actual dollar for the government. They're going to give people they usually give people very, very high quality nutritional food, fruits, vegetables, and things like fruits, vegetables that are fresh. They give people usually organic. If they want chips, they have organic chips, things like that. And there's plenty of religious groups that do this. There's other secular groups that do this as well. And they don't judge. They don't care what color you are. They don't care what religion you are. They just do this out of the kindness of their hearts. And that's the way they work. Now this shows that we don't need those programs to work. When it comes to Medicaid, we can actually work with some local charities to do the same thing. And this can really reduce down, and then what they can do is we can start buying back our own debt, which is very, very important. We need to do this because we need to have control of our own foreign policy. We have basically 2 of the top 5 paying countries for defense, essentially controlling that have that basically are controlling our debt. And they essentially, this is what we're trying to say we can go against, and we can't. And that's why China knows that they can reduce their defense spending all they want. They can do this all day with it. You look over the last 2 years with it, China has cut nearly, $40 billion out of their defense spending. They know they can do this. They know it's not a problem because they control so much of our debt. And it's not, they know that basically they can just say, when we say, oh, we don't want you there, well, they can say, nope, don't think so. And they can basically pretty much stick their finger right back in our face and say, don't think so, get out of our face, move along. And that's what we're dealing with here. And that's why it's very, very important, why a currency for a nation is very, very important to be under sound money, and why you don't want to have it under a fake thing like a fiat currency and run under central banking, because then you're in the situation like Venezuela's at, and we can go there very, very quickly. It can happen within a year or two. And right now, we're basically having our whole economy hampered by an actual policy of debt spending, just massive debt spending. And we can actually get rid of it by essentially taking what money, things are actually on the budget, let them all expire, and basically have a vote on each individual thing. If it does not get 60 votes in the Senate, and pass with majority in the House of Representatives, don't let it go through, and scratch it off the list. Keep going one by one by one by one. If it cannot reach those thresholds, keep going one by one by one by one, and keep scratching it off the list. If it cannot get in both houses, and until you get to that list of those short things in each of the 12 spending bills, you limit those down. You'll be real surprised on those spending bills what ends up being left, and you'll have a list that's very, very short, and that budget is going to be very, very small. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow you to buy back these loans, and that debt clock, instead of going up, it's going to go down. Because you're going to start buying back loans, and eventually you're going to be reducing that debt down. And it's going to be very, very good for the country. And eventually, when you do this, you're going to reduce all these things down. Now, and the end result is going to be the spending is going to help out the currency itself, obviously, by going to an actual real currency that's actually has held value for thousands of years, as well as you're going to help out the purchasing power of the poorest citizens by not putting it into a fiat currency, which allows the people who hold it first to get the most value, which means those in the financial industry. And you're also going to eliminate the whole issue with the problem of the eventual currency crisis, of the whole thing collapsing because of all the debt. Because eventually there's going to come to a time where they're going to say, no, we're not buying any more of this debt, and no one else is going to buy it because it's worthless. They can't keep selling it off to retirement people that are actually on public that are actually on pension on government pension retirements. They can't force that on people anymore with it, because eventually you're going to be left with nothing left, and you can't keep doing that, and essentially you're going to be left with a whole big currency crisis where it's going to explode, because no other country is going to buy it, and that's the only way to actually sell it off where it's actually any value. And this is why we need to flip around the ship. And this only can happen with the actual change of actual policy. And it's not going to be happy for people who are neoconservatives, and it's not going to be happy for pretty much majority of the Democrats. It's going to basically be a very, very rough shift because many things are going to get cut. But it means basically the whole economic ship not sinking. Now it applies to all other countries with it, but the United States is the one that essentially is one that's doing the most damage, and because we're essentially the universal currency, it causes a lot of damage internationally as well because people rely on our actions, and that's where the whole thing ends up falling like a whole house of cards. And this is where other countries could actually learn from this and could actually not repeat what's going on. I mean, basically, the U.S. is going down the whole road that Venezuela and Greece is going down. People might say, "Oh, but Greece is a smaller country." Well, and so is Venezuela economically. Well, yes, but when you keep adding on, you keep contributing to the same problems. You don't need as high of a debt to GDP ratio because you have a larger base with it. But the fact is you're masking a lot of the problems because of that. And if you like this, we're gonna end it right here with it. But if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share the wheel around social media to your friends and everyone else, and check out my Patreon page. If you can't donate, make sure to share it with someone who else can. And this is about it for the night. And that's about everything.